Right, let's continue. We all get rejected. It's a fact of life. Don't worry about it. It happens. You know, I mentioned this morning, I published many papers over the course of my career, and I think with the exception of one, they were all initially rejected. And that's the way it works. Not necessarily rejected as in, this is bad science, go away and never come back. But this was just like, this can be improved. And you could do this and this and this to make it somewhat better, please do so. Right? Only one paper, ever, that I submitted, came back after some time, with peer review comments, this is a great paper, I have nothing to comment on. I actually didn't believe that. So I'm a bit skeptical in that sense. Having said that, whenever I get referees' reports back as editor now, that say, this is a great paper, accept it as is, I usually send it to another referee, because I don't believe that. Anyway, so journal rejection is not a problem. It happens to all of us, it happens to junior people, it happens to senior people. It's nothing personal. It's just someone else, a peer, a scientist in your field, who has read, probably more than one, who have read your article. They have had their thoughts, maybe they were reading your paper, and they thought, oh, well, what about this and this aspect? Oh, the authors don't say anything about it. Maybe it would be useful if they actually did say something about it. So you're asked to add maybe a paragraph or two on an aspect that the referee finds interesting. And that's fine. So those aspects usually are triggered by the referee being interested in your work, not by you being who you are and the referee not liking you, right? That hardly ever happens. Having said that, it can, particularly the first time or the first few times, when your paper gets rejected, it can be quite disheartening because you might have to do a lot of work. And it might feel very personal. I admit, sometimes when I get reports, I'm thinking, oh my God, really, did the referee have to say it in those words? Because sometimes they're quite harsh. It was mentioned this morning by one of the people asking questions. The gentleman over there asked the question. Yes, referees' reports can be quite harsh, but don't take them personally. So how can you deal with them? So that's the aim of this afternoon's workshop. How do we deal with rejection, and how do we then go about responding to the criticism? I think the main message I would like to give you here is when you respond, always respond politely. Right? It's a professional interaction. Be polite to editor and referee. Don't be rude on this. So this is what we're planning to go to talk about. First we'll talk about the peer review process. How does that process work? Because particularly for many of the junior people here, this might be a big black box. You send your paper off and at some point it comes back with comments. That's called the peer review process, but there's a whole process to go through before you get your comments. We'll talk about causes of rejection. We'll look at a few example rejection letters, real letters that authors received from various publications. We've blacked out the names of the publication and the author, of course, for privacy reasons. Then we're talking a bit about how do you process a rejection letter. This is a mental issue, right? A psychological issue. But then also try to understand reviewers' comments and then how to deal with them and respond. Most importantly, how do you avoid rejection in the first place? So peer review, to get started, is the gold standard. As I said this morning, it's the backbone of academic publishing. It gives a stamp of approval to a published paper in a peer-reviewed journal. Standards vary according to scientific discipline, sometimes publisher and journal, but it is a crucial step in the process of academic publishing because it helps ensure the authenticity and accuracy of scientific research. It validates your work, of course, because someone else has looked at it and thought it was worth publishing. And so, in essence, it has been looked at, your paper has been looked at by another scientist who was deemed to have a sufficient track record in your area to warrant, this guy or lady being asked to provide comments that are taken seriously by the editor. The number of reviewers changes with discipline. I said that this morning. In my field, usually it's one reviewer. Nature may have 4 to 6 reviewers. Biology journals tend to have 3 to 5 or so. Earlier, a few months ago, I wrote a review article for the journal Space Science Reviews, and they require 2 reviewers, so it varies depending on the journal and depending on the field. Usually, peer review is confidential. When I, as an editor, send a paper out for peer review, I guarantee the peer reviewers privacy and secrecy, in essence. I will not tell the authors who their peer reviewer was. It only happened once in my career that at some point I was at a conference and I met an author of a paper who had received quite negative reports. Again, one report in our field. And this author, she was a bit immature, to be honest. She started bombarding me with questions about who the peer reviewer was. And I couldn't answer the question, of course, but she started guessing names there. Now, obviously, any field is relatively small, so a subject expert in your field is likely someone you know, particularly if they're a bit more senior and I have been asked to peer review your paper. And actually, in the end, I didn't say anything, right? She actually got to 3 names, and I had actually sent the paper to 2 of those 3 names. So this lady actually made a very good guess, but I felt very, very uncomfortable as editor being asked questions about the peer reviewer. So please don't do that ever if you meet an editor, because that's unprofessional. The point of this is that reviewers should feel at ease, commenting professionally without the fear of retribution, right? So for instance, if you're a graduate student and you've been asked to review a paper by a very senior person in the field, who might have some influence on your future career, if you can be, if your identity can remain confidential, you will likely give a fair and frank assessment of that senior scientist's paper. But if you know that a senior scientist is going to know your name, you're not going to be as critical. The whole point of peer review is that papers get appraised critically, but fairly. Okay, with that out of the way, let's have a look at the cycle of peer review. So what happens is the following. First of all, here we are, the authors. We have done our research, we're very proud, we have written a paper, which we think is absolutely fantastic, so we sent it off to a journal. Journal submission, that's the top bar down there. That's when the peer review process starts. The first thing that happens, actually Nicole said that as well in AGO, it goes through a quality assessment. Does the paper, the submitted paper, does it meet minimum quality requirements? Is the formatting correct? Is the language accessible? Things like that. Yeah. Once that's been done, it gets sent on to a scientific editor. Now, the scientific editor is, is the goalkeeper, in essence, right? The scientific editor looks at the paper to see if the paper matches the aims and scope of the journal, and if it would be a good fit for the journal. If not, the paper gets rejected at that point. That's called a desk rejection. So that's then the end of it, unless sometimes you can make a case to the editor that the editor misunderstood the paper because it was really within the aims and scope of the journal because of the following reasons. You write a letter about that, right? And then you ask the editor, can you please have another chance and send it out for peer review? Sometimes editors are sensitive to such appeals, and if you think that you have the right arguments, you should absolutely do that and ask the editor to reconsider. In most cases, authors will be disappointed, as you can imagine, of course, and they will go to another journal. So that happens with desk rejection. If the paper is deemed to be qualitatively good enough, according to quality assurance, and also scientifically sufficiently interesting, the editor will likely send it off to anywhere between 1 and a few peer reviewers. That's this bar, the third bar, expert peer review. So usually your paper gets sent to a number of people in your field who know about the field fairly well. Now, let me tell you a bit of a secret here. It's not easy to find referees. As an editor, I often have to ask a number of people before someone says, yes, I will do it within the time frame that you want me to review a paper in. is not necessarily the first person I ask. But of course, the first person I ask is who I think the best person for the paper. So if you have to go down the line a few people, you may not get the absolute expert. And so this might happen to your paper as well. The consequence of that is that sometimes you get reports, you might receive a report on the paper with comments that you think, that doesn't quite make sense because the referee didn't quite understand it. And that's perfectly fine to respond, okay? But that might happen. So your paper will not always go to the top person in the field simply because that person may not have the time to do it at that particular point in time. So the expert peer reviewers, one or more, will write a report, hopefully within a limited time frame. Regular journals might take a month or slightly longer to process those reports. Those reports go back to the editor. The editor is not supposed to be just a letterbox, but the editor is supposed to look at those reports, maybe put them together and make an assessment as to whether it's worth sending the paper back to the authors for revisions, or whether it's, there's no hope and the paper has to be rejected. Hopefully you are in the situation that there is a lot of hope and that your paper can be possibly accepted after some revision. That's this whole cycle here with the brownish arrow at the bottom, goes back to the authors, you resubmit, and the whole process happens again. Of course, after you resubmit, you won't have a desk rejection happen, but it goes through the same cycle. The second part of the cycle, after revisions, usually goes a bit faster. Now, depending on the field that you're in, sometimes you have more than even 2 cycles, and that happens, for instance, in my field, because we only have a very small number of primary journals. We only have about 5 or 6 primary journals in astrophysics. So the aim of our editors is not to reject as many papers as possible, because they can go to the next journal anyway, but to help authors improve their science until the papers meet the minimum standard for acceptance. And so that's a different kind of philosophy. And so I have seen peer review rounds that go 4 or 5 rounds with editors. Those are papers that originally are quite bad, actually. Usually, it's 1 or 2 rounds. I had some comments here that I wanted to add. So here's an example. There was a study in the journal Biological Conservation. Over the past 7 years, 4,575 manuscripts were submitted, and just under half of those were sent out for review. There's more than half, 60% of the papers submitted to that biological journal were actually rejected by the editor. And it was actually noticed, and I don't have information here about Indonesian authors, but they split this out by Chinese authors and others. And Chinese authors got their papers rejected at the rate of 71%, and everyone else at 50%. So more Chinese authors were rejected than any other authors. I think personally that this may have to do with the affiliation to some extent of where you are. And we were just talking about this over lunch. I get told by my Chinese colleagues sometimes that they feel that they are unfairly treated because they're from China. I was talking to my colleagues from India, and they say the same applies to India and also here in Indonesia. So this is sad, because I think a paper should be assessed on its merits and not on where the author comes from. But so be aware that sometimes there is a bit of a bias in the process by editors and also by reviewers. I have seen this on occasion that my Chinese students wrote papers, and I'm the second author. I also do language editing myself. So I make sure that when we submit papers to peer-reviewed journals, the language is top. There should be very little to comment about. And then sometimes what happens is you get a referee's report, and the first line of the report is, this paper could do with English language editing. I actually get very upset when that happens, because I take that personally. I think my own editing is good enough, right? I do this freelance as well. So there are some issues, some undercurrents here, that sometimes there might be a bias based on where you're from, and that's completely unfair.